Hello, my name is Amy Vanderhyde, Deputy Village Clerk for the Village of Menomonee Falls. Today, in this video, we will be talking about poll books. Types of poll lists. There's the regular poll list, includes voters' names, addresses, ward numbers, notations whether the voter has voted an absentee ballot or not. Supplemental poll lists, including anyone registering in the clerk's office after the mail-in deadline of 20 days before the election. Election day registration list, so those who register on election day, and the absentee ballot listing, which is used by the absentee processors at Central Count. There is one in the poll books for reference only, but there's no need to use it for anything else. This is a mock poll book, or the front of your poll book. Note in the green circle, this is something you'd fill in at the very end of the night. The last voter number you used, and the page number of the last voter. Number of the absentee electors does not need to be filled in because they are done at Central Count. On the bottom, you'll see the signature lines. If you work at a poll book, you need to sign it, whether it would be somebody just filling in for somebody using the restroom. If you work at the book, you need to sign. So sign when you sit. This is a sample document of the poll book page. Notice on the left-hand side, the top two little circles, you'll see an MF and an HAM. These are the ballot styles. So if you have a ward which has split ward, you would notice it has two ballot styles. This is so you know exactly what ballot to give the voter. So the first one would be Menomonee Falls ballot, and the second one would be a Hamilton ballot. Again, these are both people who are in the same ward. On the right-hand side, you'll notice the notations are inside the box where the voter will sign. So if an absentee was issued or returned, you would see it here. If an absentee is issued, we will get into that a little bit later. But if it says absentee returned, please contact your chief inspector if the voter is there to vote. They cannot vote right if they have an absentee returned. Another notation may be, have you moved? This is something where the voter has been pegged for possibly moving due to registering a vehicle in another state or updating something with the post office or something of that sort with the government. Supplemental poll lists. This is going to look exactly like the poll books, but they will be behind the regular poll book. This is only people who registered after the cutoff of 20 days before the election. The election day registration list. This is where you would put those stickers that were created at the registration table. They would have the person's name and address on it. You would assign them the next voter number and put NR in the log, and they would sign here just like the normal poll book. So this is a diagram showing what the two poll workers at the table will do. Person on the left will ask the voter to state their name, find the name in the poll list, ask the voter to state their address, verifies the address that is in the poll list, checks the photo ID, not for address, but for just their ID and their name. The voter will sign the poll list, write the voter number on the poll list next to the voter's name. You will initial the ballot and give the ballot to the next person to initial as well. Person on the right also has the poll list, finds the person's name and address, verifies the photo ID, has the grid and assigns the number, and states the number to the other poll workers so they can write it down, writes the voter's number on the poll list next to the voter's name, and writes the poll list page number on the grid. Select the correct ward ballot, which we talked about earlier, how to tell which one, and initial it. And then once both inspectors initial the ballot, it can be given to the voter to go vote. State show sign. When a person walks up to the voter table or the poll book table, they first need to state their name. The voter is asked to state their name. All voters must state their name unless they are confidential voters. If you know the voter, they still must state their name. Find the voter in the poll book. If the voter's name has changed, they need to re-register. State their address. The voter is also required to state their address. The poll worker must verify the address matches what is in the poll book. If it is not the same address, the voter will need to be directed to the registration table to re-register as a new address. If there is a typo, please mark it in the poll book because we can change typos such as a 4 instead of an 8 or those type of errors. If they did move though, and it was just one number off, they do need to re-register. They would then sign the poll book after they state their name and address. Sometimes we find that's helpful when we ask somebody to state their name. We don't have them state their name and address together, but just one and then the other. This gives you time to actually find the name in the poll book, read the address, and then verify it matches the name on their photo ID and view their photo ID. The Wisconsin law was amended in November of 2019 to allow voters to have the poll workers or assisters of their choosing to state their name and address on their behalf. Voters can also provide their information in writing to poll workers or assisters. If a voter is not registered or is not on the poll list, but claims that they should be, do not let them vote until you check with clerk services at 262-532-4200. If there's any questions on anything, please find your chief inspector. So again, when a person walks up to the poll book, they're going to state their name, state their address, and then sign. Photo ID. They're going to show their photo ID at the poll book table. They are not required to have you handle their photo ID. You don't have to touch it, just leave it on the table and view it. The poll worker will verify that the name on the ID conforms to that on the poll list. The name on the ID may be a variation of the name on the list. This is acceptable. Robert and Bob is an example. Poll workers verify that the photo reasonably resembles the voter and is unexpired. If it is expired, it must meet the certain criteria that we will talk about later. If the voter does not have an acceptable photo ID, the voter may have the option to vote provisionally. The photo ID does not need to include the correct address. If somebody changes addresses, they do not have to change their ID in terms of their driver's license. They can just change the address with the DMV. So again, you are not required to have to handle the photo ID. You can just let it stay on the table or the person can hold it for you. The next is where they sign the poll list. So every voter must sign the regular poll list, supplemental poll list, or the new registration poll list. The voters only sign in one of the books. So prioritize one book to be the signature book between the two. The Wisconsin Election Commission states that a voter can use a stamp on the poll list as their signature. Designate which list to have the voter sign and keep with that. We don't want to have some signatures in one book and some in another. The voter only receives a voter number and ballot after they have signed or stamped the poll list. Things like an X or a dot or a slash are also acceptable if that is their official mark for signature. Voter not able to sign the poll list. So some voters may not be able to sign the poll list themselves. In this case, two poll workers must determine whether the voter can sign. And if the poll workers determine the voter cannot sign, then the poll workers must write exempt by order of inspector on the signature line. But if the voter has not signed the list because the poll workers forgot to have them sign, ask the chief inspector to note it, the name and number of the voter in the inspector statement. This next slide talks about number grids. So this is your number grid, which you will start out always as voter number 1 at each table because we now are doing central count. You don't have the absentee numbers on here. So each voter receives a number, otherwise known as the voter number. Voters get the numbers sequentially starting at the number 1. Next to each number, write the page number of the voter. This helps us reconcile numbers in the end of the night. The number of ballots cast in the voting machine must match the number given out on the grids. Note, encircled in green, the new registrants get an NR on the line next to their voter number. As you can see, an example is voter number 23 was a new registration. Absentee voters at the polls. This has changed recently since we started central count. So absentee voters are prohibited from voting in person on election day if they have returned their absentee ballot either by mail or hand delivery. Voters with spoiled ballots that did not receive or return a replacement ballot can vote in person at the polling place on election day. Poll workers must check for the notation on the poll list absentee for each voter. If the voter is an absentee voter, check the absentee list to determine the status of the absentee ballot. If the ballot was returned, then the voter cannot vote at the polling place. If the ballot was not returned, then the poll worker must ask the voter, did you mail or personally deliver your absentee ballot to the clerk's services? If yes, they cannot vote. If no, they can. Voters are no longer able to return ballots to polling places on election day. This is due to absentee ballots being processed at a central count location. On election day, absentee ballots can be returned to clerk services until 7 p.m. or the designated central count location until 8. Notify your chief inspector to assist the voter to the correct location. So let's go over a few things from this page. The absentee voter log will be the exact same thing as what you find in your poll book. So you don't really need to reference it unless somebody does not agree with what you have in the poll book. Then I would reference that document in the back. If they still do not believe that they've returned their absentee, contact their chief inspector, who will take the following measures to either contact clerk services or identify if the person really returned their ballot. If the person says they put their ballot in the mail stream, that is considered return, whether we have received it or not. Voters returning their ballots to the polling place, they need to go either to clerk services or central count to turn in their ballot. They cannot give it to you at the polling place. So if you're at a table, do not accept the ballot. Please contact your chief inspector. Issuing a ballot. The ballot has a color block unless white. The poll workers must give the voter the correct color block based on the color of the poll list and number grid. Your poll list should match your color ballots, and so should the number grid. The only reason why it would not match is if you have a split ward where you have 2 colored ballots and 1 poll book. The ballot must have 2 initials on it from the poll workers. Please do not initial ballots ahead of time. You may not initial ballots before the voter has checked in at the poll list table. Reasons for this. The Wisconsin Election Commission does not allow this practice. Live ballot stock could be left on tables if the polling place needed to be evacuated. If 2 ballots were accidentally given to a voter by mistake, the voter has now 2 live ballots to vote and enter into the voting machine. This would cause our numbers to be off at the end of the night, and people are not allowed to vote twice. Photo identification. Voters are required to show proof of ID in order to receive a ballot. Reviewing photo ID. Election inspectors will review. The photo must reasonably resemble the elector, but keep in mind that appearances change over the years. Things that can change are glasses, hair color, facial features slightly just from aging. That is completely okay. It does not have to be an exact copy, but it needs to be reasonably resemble. The elector's name. The name must conform to that on their voter registration, but does not have to be identical. We talked about Robert and Bob. An expiration date. You always must be checking the expiration date as well. It must have an expiration date and must meet the expiration date requirements. Remember, the photo ID does not include their current address. We are not checking their address against the proof of identification, but what the voter states. The voter's signature on the photo ID does not need to be compared to that against the registration application or on the poll list. Here's a document showing all the acceptable forms of photo ID. This will be given to you in each of the poll books so that you have it on election day. Things that are acceptable are Wisconsin driver's licenses, state IDs, U.S. uniform services, U.S. passport books or cards, veteran affair cards, university or technical college, plus enrollment verification, Wisconsin driver state ID or IDPP receipt. So even if they don't have their driver's license yet, but they have the receipt, that does count. Certificate of naturalization or tribal IDs. So this is a list of photo identification. Acceptable photo identification can include the Wisconsin state driver's license, as we talked about, and the standard is maybe revoked or suspended, unexpired, or expired after the date of 11/3 of 2020. This date has changed from previous documents due to us having a new general election. So the state identification card is the same, unexpired or expired after 11/3 of 2020. Military ID card issued by U.S. Uniformed Services, unexpired or expired after 11/3 of 2020. Military ID card issued by a Veterans Association may be expired. Some may be indicating indefinite, so that's never expired. Veteran Affairs ID card unexpired or have no expiration date. Photo ID cards issued by Wisconsin accredited university or college or technical college. The date that the card was issued must be on there, the signature of the student, and it must be expired no later than 2 years from date of issuance. A document that provides enrollment, such as a tuition fee, receipt, enrollment verification letter, or class schedule must also be shown for proof of identification. The U.S. passport booklet or card must be unexpired or expired after 11/3 of 2020. Certificate of naturalization, unexpired or issued no earlier than 2 years before the election. Wisconsin DOT driving receipt, unexpired or valid for 45 days from the date issued. The DOT ID receipt would be the same. An ID card issued by federally recognized Wisconsin tribe can be expired or unexpired. A Wisconsin DMV ID petition process photo receipt is only valid for 180 days from issuance. Citation or notice of revoked or suspended driver's license, unexpired or dated within 60 days of the election, and a state of Wisconsin ID card, unexpired or expired after 11/3 of 2020. This would be issued to someone without a photo on it because they have a religious objection of being photographed. If somebody comes up to the register poll book table with a confined voters identification card, this would not have a photo ID on it, but would give you a number, and it's their confidential number. This is an acceptable form of photo ID because they do not have to show anything being confidential voters. If there is a confidential voter, your ward will know. We will always let your chief inspectors know of these things. So if somebody doesn't have a photo ID, they must be given this free ID identification card process document. This would allow them to go to the DMV, follow the different rules listed, and get something to be able to vote on election day. That is all we have for the poll book station video. We hope that you view all the rest of your videos and have a great election day.